I'm Lynn Pasquarella. I'm the president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's afternoon plenary, What Universities Owe Democracy. Political polarization, partisanship, and disinformation are eroding democracies around the world. Our two distinguished speakers will consider how universities can prepare students to participate in and protect our democracy, and how higher education should respond to attacks on both democracy and civil interaction. I'm honored to be joined today by Ronald J. Daniels, who served as the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University since 2009, and who tackles these issues head-on in his book, What Universities Owe Democracy, from which the title of this session was taken, and by Richard Haass, a veteran diplomat and prominent voice in American foreign policy, now in his 20th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations. His most recent book, The Bill of Obligations, 10 Habits of Good Citizens, serves as a compelling reminder that if our democracy is to endure, it will require all Americans to embrace common obligations despite our differences. We're going to jump right in to our session today, and I'm first going to turn to Ron, who's going to offer some framing comments around the urgent matters before us. So, Ron.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Lynn, for your introduction, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, too, to ACCU and Father Holtschneider for the invitation to be able to participate in this session today. And it's a genuine privilege to share the stage, even if virtually, with Richard Haass, whose latest book, The Bill of Obligations, I strongly urge you to read. I'm honored also that today's panel references the title of my recent book that I co-wrote with Phil Spector and Grant Shreve. Grant Shreve is somewhere back there, but that book is entitled What Universities Owe Democracy. The impetus for this book was seeded several years ago when it became undeniable that liberal democracy in the United States and indeed abroad was backsliding, and that we saw in too many different contexts an authoritarian ascendance. And while the focus of anti-democratic populism has been held in abeyance in some places and in some elections, I don't believe that, as some have argued, that the fever has broken. To my mind, democracy is still very challenged, and it turns out that democracy is fragile, much more fragile, I think, than any of us had really appreciated. Over the past decade, according to the Varieties of Democracy Institute, the share of the world's population living in democracies has plummeted from 52 to 32%. That is a staggering decline in a relatively short period of time. Fair and free elections are still under threat here and abroad. And in countries ranging from Brazil to Hungary to Russia, authoritarian leaders have continued to fuel disinformation campaigns, to dismantle checks on their power, and to wage unjust wars. Our moment demands that we continue to step up in the defense of the democratic experiment. This is the responsibility, I believe, not only of citizens, but of core institutions as well. Now, over the years, I've occasionally quizzed friends and colleagues as to which of the institutions they believe are really core, indispensable to democracy. You can imagine I'm a lot of fun at parties. I don't get invited to that many parties when you ask questions like that. But the answers are typically the same. When asked to identify what are the key institutions of democracy, the list gets rhymed off pretty quickly. Independent media, non-corrupt independent courts, competitive party politics, and so on. And colleges and universities seldom, if ever, make the cut on this list. And as I argue in my book, this is a grave oversight. Our colleges and universities are critical, and yes, even indispensable to the maintenance of healthy, flourishing democracies. And just as important, liberal democracy is the best soil for thriving universities. This is in no small part because universities and liberal democracy share so many values. Each places a premium on freedom of speech and thought, on tolerance for dissent, on the free flow of information and ideas, and on share and distributed authority. It is perhaps then no surprise that nearly 90 of the top 100 universities in the world, according to Times Higher Education, are located in democracies, and that studies have shown that higher levels of college education make democracies more likely to endure and autocracies more likely to democratize. Nowhere is this basic truth more visible than in this country, where our great diversity of colleges and universities, among which every one of your institutions is a vital part, have become intimately woven into the fabric of democratic life. But higher education needs to be doing more to live up to its democratic promise. In my book, I outline 4 distinct areas in which colleges and universities support liberal democracy, and in which I think that they have, in recent years, we have failed to live up to our full potential. What are the areas in which we could play a role? Well, we advance social mobility. We steward facts, cultivate expertise, and check power. We foster pluralism by bringing people together from vastly different backgrounds, beliefs, and perspectives, and teach them how to engage with one another. And we educate students in the values, history, skills, and aspirations necessary for good democratic citizenship. This is what we could do. This is what we should do. It's this last function, civic education, that I want to discuss today. It's an area where I believe our colleges and universities have, in this country and indeed abroad, fallen tragically short. We have not been effective in educating students in the habits and values of democratic citizenship. To my mind, these habits include, but are not limited to, a familiarity with the history and theory of democracy and its institutions, the ability to reason critically and discern true information from false information, a commitment to ideals of tolerance and equality, and finally, an aspiration, an appetite for collective action and civic friendship. For decades, higher education as a sector has allowed K-12 education to bear practically the full burden of civic education. But unfortunately, we know that quality civics in primary and secondary schools in this country is at best uneven, despite the best efforts of so many committed educators. Indeed, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only about 25% of U.S. students demonstrate proficiency in civics, and only slightly more than 20% receive any formalized or dedicated instruction in civics. This is alarming, and it's woeful, and it's serious. It's deeply troubling, especially at a moment when less than half of American adults can name all 3 branches of government, and where younger generations, including so many of our students, are in the throes of what one global study has described as democratic malaise. I've seen these deficits firsthand. Several years ago, we at Johns Hopkins piloted a panel during student orientation focused entirely on introducing our students to the ideas of academic freedom and free speech. We enlisted faculty members from across the ideological and disciplinary spectrums to explain the significance of this core value, not only to the academy, but indeed to democracy. I have to confess, at first I worried that the content would be too rudimentary. But when I approached several of our students after the session, the first time we did this, to get a sense of how they responded to the experience, what they learned, was it too rudimentary, too insulting to them, many, far too many, confessed that until they had this introduction in their first year orientation at a university, they had never been exposed to the case for free speech in their high schools. Everything in that session, The sources of authority invoked, the rationale, the principles articulated were brand new to them. I was stunned. I was gobsmacked. 2 years later, when I was teaching an undergraduate seminar, largely used to develop the book on what universities owe democracy, I asked my students early on if any of them had learned about core democratic ideas and institutions in high school, and what was the character of that introduction. And a dispiritedly small number of hands went up. And even then, most of the hands were kind of at half-mast, kind of tentative, which again said so much. Clearly then, when it comes to civics instruction, our schools are not doing nearly enough. We can't rely on them. The responsibility for remedying this situation, I believe, must fall on the entire educational continuum. And I know that Richard's going to make this case passionately in a few moments. This includes, though, colleges and universities. We can't just sort of remit this to the K-12 system and say, get better, and we'll wait for you to do that. We can't sit on the sidelines. We should be doing vastly more to educate our students in the norms, the values, the history of democracy, and to cultivate in them the skills and dispositions that undergird good democratic citizenship. If you don't educate students for these particular competencies, it's not like they're just going to get it from the ether. It has to be deliberately transmitted. That's our obligation. Now, every time I've made this claim in print, there is someone, without fail, who says, more often than not in the form of a tweet, the colleges simply have no business wearing the mantle of civic education. Colleges prepare students for careers, not for democratic citizenship. We're not in the values game. I know this room, of all rooms, knows how myopic and ill-founded that argument is. It's great to be here. It's also an attitude that is deeply ahistorical for this country. As I was researching my book, I was struck to learn that not only is a call for universities to be beacons of civic education not new, in fact, it's almost as old as the nation itself. In 1790, George Washington delivered his first State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress, not here in DC, but in New York. And compared to the marathon performance of today's presidents, modern presidents, Washington's remarks were mercifully short, only about 1,200 words. Given the speech's brevity, it is significant and surprising for many to discover that 230 of those 1,200 words, we've counted them, or about a fifth of the speech, are devoted to the role of colleges and universities in the new republic. Washington began by telling Congress that nothing is more deserving of federal support than the promotion of science and literature, which he contended is the surest basis of happiness. The humanities majors in this audience may have a bone to pick with that one, but at least he centrally located the idea that there was a role for universities and a connection to the core democratic project. Washington then pivoted to higher education's importance to sustaining a self-governing society. Among the most important functions of colleges and universities is to teach students, quote, to know and to value their own rights, to discern and provide against invasions of them, and to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority. It's hard to imagine that these ideas, these principles, aren't just as salient today as they were then. It's been 233 years since Washington's first State of the Union. Yet colleges and universities have, in truth, delivered on his call to action only imperfectly and unevenly. Periods of advancement and innovation have often been followed by stagnation and regress. The story begins in the early 19th century when college presidents taught annual capstone courses in moral philosophy to graduating seniors, which were meant as a form of preparation for civic participation. And those were truly the days when college presidents could devote themselves to endless conversations with small groups of students about moral philosophy. Happens less and less these days, as we know. But by the 1870s, these courses faded as emerging disciplines like political science, economics, and sociology became crucial sites of democratic education, as they should. However, because undergraduates also had so much more choice in what they studied, only a fraction of students reaped the benefits of these fields' insights. The two world wars revitalized interest in the possibilities of widespread democracy education in the form of general education requirements. After World War II, Truman even convened a National Commission on Higher Education and its role in democracy. In its report, the commission made the forceful claim that the first and most essential charge upon higher education is that at all levels and all fields of its specialization, it shall be the carrier of democratic values, ideals, and process. This is a stirring call that resonates powerfully even today. Yet in the decades that followed the Truman Report, colleges and universities again let other priorities, from shifting norms of faculty autonomy to undergraduate careerism to a quest for scientific dominance, take precedence over democracy. By the 1970s, democratic education at the university level had waned significantly. Former Harvard President Derek Bok recalled that when he started his career during this era, it seemed to him that the only institutions of higher education that seemed to be doing anything remotely related to civics and practical ethics were Catholic colleges and universities. Beginning in the 1980s, however, another renaissance in civics was underway with the advent of service learning and the founding of organizations like Campus Compact. Today, hundreds of institute centers and offices of learning operate at colleges and universities across the country, including, I know, at so many of your institutions, as vital expressions of your foundational commitment to service for others. Because of these enduring efforts, service learning has become perhaps the single most successful civic education moment in American history. And I embrace the aims of service learning. Indeed, I began my career as an academic leader during its heyday. At the time, with the communist world imploding and liberal democracy seemingly set for global predominance, it felt right for universities to focus our civic learning efforts on community service. And the impact of this educational experience has been unequivocally positive, introducing students to volunteerism, making them more tolerant, and teaching them leadership skills. But I worry that service learning alone does not suffice as an education in democracy. It generally does not seek to explain why democratic values matter or ask hard, nuanced questions about why democracies have fallen short of the values they proclaim. Nor it is designed to nurture affinity for democracy as a system of popular governance or to instill in students the knowledge necessary to engage fully with democratic institutions and processes. Simply put, we must do more to ensure that our students are coming into contact with coursework in the values, history, and practices of democracy. And for this reason, I have suggested that colleges and universities across the board institute a democracy requirement into their curriculum. Now, this could take any of a number of possible forms, but should, I believe, strongly believe, balance a rigorous investigation of the ways in which the democratic experiment in the United States and elsewhere has fulfilled its aspirations, alongside a sober recognition of the ways in which democracy has fallen tragically short, as well as the obligation of citizens in the work of realizing democracy's promise. This is a tall order with no shortage of obstacles. Faculty will no doubt voice resistance to, or even skepticism with these proposals. There's a risk that any conversation about common values disintegrates into duke it out partisan battle. That's what we do a lot in this country these days. We also know how quickly observers and pundits on both the left and the right may try to accuse us of indoctrination. Yet I don't think that any of these reasons are sufficient to cause us to shy away from the core challenge. Change is possible, even when the stakes are high. We have begun to see real progress as colleges and universities in red and blue states alike have begun to take up the cause. Purdue University recently instituted a new civics literacy requirement for graduation. Stanford has designed a citizenship course for first-year students as a central part of their new core curriculum. And Longwood University in Virginia has also launched a new core curriculum designed around producing citizen leaders in a time of democratic erosion. At my own university, Johns Hopkins, our SNF Agora Institute has helped to dramatically increase the number of courses in democracy we offer, many taught by such luminaries like Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum. Additionally, we have, for the past 2 years, hosted a Democracy Day as part of our student orientation, and this event ensures that all of our incoming first years are given the opportunity to speak with a diverse cadre of faculty from divisions across the institution in medicine, public health, education, and social sciences about the challenges they see confronting democracy, to hear from local elected officials, and to learn about opportunities for involvement and action. We still have more to do at Hopkins. I dream of a mandatory course in our curriculum, and that is being negotiated, debated, critiqued as we speak. But I'm encouraged by the progress we have made in harnessing the expertise and interest across our faculty. I think faculty are recognizing the moment of peril that we are in this country, and our obligation to rethink our traditional stance around this issue. Catholic colleges and universities have a special role to play in civic education. Time and time again, across the decades, your institutions have distinguished themselves as keepers of the civic flame. Indeed, one study found that faculty at Catholic colleges and universities were far more likely than their peers at non-Catholic institutions to support education as a pedagogical priority. I know that many of your schools, from St. Anselm College to Georgetown University to Barry University and so many more, are already engaged in developing ever more robust and comprehensive civic education efforts. And additionally, the recently formed Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Coalition promises to connect colleges and universities engaged in this work and share insight and best practices. 75 years ago, not long after the end of World War II, United States Senator James E. Murray spoke at the National Catholic Education Association about the importance of democratic education. He said then that the, quote, ways of democracy are painfully slow and cumbersome, if only because we ourselves are painfully slow in developing within our own souls those virtues which are so essential to the successful functioning of democracy. Now, as then, our institutions of higher education have a responsibility, have a duty to cultivate the virtues and habits of democratic life. Our democracy depends on it. I commend you for the work already underway and look forward to continuing to move this shared project alongside with you. Thank you for the privilege of allowing me to be here today.
Thank you so much, Ron. So Richard is joining us virtually. And Richard, in the beginning of your new book, you confess that what keeps you up at night, it's not so much issues of foreign relations these days, but the kind of erosion of American democracy that Ron has just outlined. And yet, throughout the book, you provide a sense of hope and optimism, that there's a way forward, and that universities play a critical role in helping us find that way forward. So I'd love to hear more about your book.
It's both a treat and difficult to come after Ron. My initial reaction is basically to say amen to everything he said. agree with it entirely, both in his analysis and in the direction of his prescription. And it's important to point out that he doesn't only talk the talk, but he is walking the walk, and what he and his colleagues are doing at Johns Hopkins. Let me take a step back, though, and make a broader argument. It's the one I write about in the Bill of Obligations. And as you suggest, this is not a book I thought I'd be writing. I'm a foreign policy guy, and I ended up in a different place than a half dozen years I would have intended. But if you did a Rorschach test or just a word association, you mentioned the word democracy. I think many people would say things like freedom, rights, and all that's totally understandable. It's in part what distinguishes democracies from the alternatives, and it's obviously true in the American experience. When you think about the Constitution, the biggest criticism of the Constitution when it tried to replace the wildly inefficient Articles of Confederation was that it was too strong, that it was a threat to the rights of states and individuals. And that's why you ended up with the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments is a kind of balancing. There were a lot of comments along the lines, we've just freed ourselves from the tyranny of Great Britain. We don't want to create a new tyranny here on this side of the ocean. So the idea of rights being central to democracy is obvious. And today, 2.5 centuries later, we have those who focus on political rights, essentially what Abraham Lincoln called the unfinished work of American democracy. And you have those who focus more on economic rights, things like what ought to be the floor, what should every citizen be guaranteed, should there be any conditions attached, and so forth. So we have developed debate, shall we say, about both how do we extend, or where should we extend political rights, and where should we extend economic rights. The problem with this is not that many of these arguments aren't good. Many of these ideas aren't good. They are, but they have virtually no chance of being adopted. That there simply isn't a requisite political context or environment for getting these things done. Invariably, one person's idea of rights clash with another's. This group hardly needs me to talk about the clash between them, what some see as the mother's right to choose, others the rights of the unborn, debates over Second Amendment versus rights of public safety, the debate over vaccination and masking versus public health, and so forth. So rights inevitably and invariably come into conflict, and the same holds for economic rights. And the question is, again, how do we navigate those in a society? Because if we don't, there's two likely results. One, and we see a lot of it, is gridlock. When our political institutions can't resolve these differences in rights, then I think the systems stop to deliver, and that exacerbates what Ron was talking about. If democracy is seen as a system of government unable to deliver, then it shouldn't surprise anybody that support for it further erodes. And that, again, puts a tremendous premium on how do we navigate these conflicting notions of rights. Or worse yet, I think there's the possibility, and we've had a taste of it in this country on January 6th and other days, when rights come into conflict, we end up with conflict. I spent 3 years as the American envoy to the Northern Ireland peace talks. I was George Mitchell's successor, and then I went back a decade later at the invitation of the local parties. And what we saw there is a reality where for decades life was undermined by decentralized political violence. And I would simply say none of us should feel so sanguine that we would assume that, quote unquote, this can't happen here. The answer is it can happen here. We ought not to be pessimists or defeatists, but we also should be realists. And what we've had is a glimpse of how American democracy, again, can deteriorate sharply when, again, rights come into sharp conflict, which is why I ended up writing this book. Again, it's not that there aren't a lot of good ideas out there. I just don't think right now we have a political environment where good ideas, in most instances, have a chance of being adopted. And what I've written and what I've been thinking about is not simply what are we owed in the way of political or economic rights by the government, but almost in the spirit of JFK, what is it we owe both to one another, our fellow citizens, as well as to our country? And I go through 10 obligations here. Several, again, are very consistent with Ron, the idea of being informed, which is trickier than it might seem in this age where we have information overload, but we also have misinformation overload. I talk about, I'm also very interested in being involved. Again, the fact that more than half of Americans who are eligible to vote didn't vote in these midterms, to me, is somewhat shocking. I talk about the need to respect government service, and I've become a real enthusiast for national service, both to break down barriers with government, but also to bring together Americans of different geographies, different classes, different levels of education who would never otherwise meet. I'm old enough that I remember the debate growing up in the 50s and 60s, where we used to debate America as a melting pot versus a mixing pot. We've got a different problem now. We've got an America of separate pots. And increasingly, Americans do not have common experiences, which makes it that much more difficult to come up with common approaches to challenges. We'll circle back on the teaching of civics. I couldn't agree more. We have what I would call a civics deficit in this country. I'm pretty comfortable with talking about the budget deficit. I actually think the civics deficit is worse. The quality and quantity of civics that is taught or isn't taught at in middle schools and high schools is a problem. And Ron has laid out the real problem at the secondary, at the college and university level. But since I'm speaking to you all today, what I also thought I'd do is introduce one other thought, which is the special, if you permit me, obligation, maybe opportunity is also apt, of institutions such as yours to make a difference here. And when I went through my obligations, 4 in particular, in addition to civics, I thought you all had a special potential, given your voice and given your authority. And I mean both in your colleges and universities, but also in seminaries, and ultimately in churches. One is civility. Politics are tough enough without incivility. And it's also a practical argument. Today's opponent on an issue could be tomorrow's partner. The idea of learning to disagree without going to general quarters becomes essential in a democracy. And the teaching of civility, the encouragement of it, is important. Same holding for compromise. It's interesting, coming back to Kennedy again, and profiles in courage, half of the senators he lauded were senators who compromised when compromise was unpopular. I get it that at times holding out against compromise is also a sign of courage. But in many instances in our politics, what really is courageous is to withstand extremes and work to get something done. Perhaps most central is the rejection of violence. There can't be any tolerance in a democracy, no matter what the issue is, for violence. We have other forms. If working through the system is judged to be inadequate, there's an entire tradition of civil disobedience in this country. But civil disobedience, as we saw with Gandhi, as we saw with King, is nonviolent. And civil disobedience is not a revolutionary act. It's a reformist act. It operates within the system. It accepts the sanctions of the system, be it fines or imprisonment if need be. It is not, however, a revolutionary act. It does not seek to overthrow the system. So violence is unacceptable. And who better than those with religious standing to make that point? And then fourthly, I'd say of my 10 obligations, the one that seems most apt is the idea of promoting the common good. Again, it's not simply a normative issue as this is what, we are our brother's keeper to some extent, but also it is that the fate of our brother affects our fate. So for those who are not impressed by the moral or normative argument, actually there's a self-interested argument that what happens to others in our society will ultimately come back and affect us. We saw it during the pandemic. We see it with issues of crime. We see it with questions of economic suffering and so forth. So again, I think there's a large space here for those who have religious credentials, religious authorities to act. So again, a lot of this brings us back to civics, where Ron has made written an important book. So I think the idea is that we will have a conversation, the three of us, about what civics might include, how to overcome resistance to it, and the like. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
So you two have spent the past few years thinking about similar issues. There's a lot of alignment. Are there points of divergence? Ron, what did you think of what Richard said?
So I think we're probably in vehement agreement with one another on the core agenda that we're talking about here today. So it may be that again that there's some aspects and the details that we might have different points of emphasis. But I think both of us really do share a sense of the vulnerability of this particular moment, the sense that there's something that is seriously amiss in the body politic. And I think a shared sense that we have a role to play in addressing that. And I think in both our books, the title is really to turn the tables on sort of a sense of entitlement and rather one of obligation. In his case, very clearly talking about obligation, and in my case, even asking the question instead of what is owed us as universities, but what do we owe society? So I think that too represents, again, something where there's a nice sense of shared alignment.
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about the sense of purpose that students are looking for these days, and we now have the Harvard study, the 84-year study on happiness, and we've got studies out of Stanford talking about the role of purpose in lifelong success and how those studies tie civic engagement and civic responsibility with a sense of purpose. Richard, do you want to comment on this and say a little bit more about your vision for a program of national service?
Well, again, as I said, I'm attracted to national service for multiple reasons. I like public policy proposals that check lots of boxes. One is, as I said, it gets away at the idea that government's the enemy. Most Americans, I think, don't realize that something like 25 million Americans, one way or another, work for state, local, or federal government. Government's not the other. It's not the enemy. We're the government. The government's us. And I want to associate people with a government experience that's positive. I'm not an advocate of going back to the draft, but one of the good things about the draft was that it brought people together, and it did give this common experience, the whole greatest generation sort of theme. So even now, I'm not advocating for mandatory public service, but I do think it would be helpful in getting Americans together whose lives would never normally intersect, which has gotten worse in some ways given social media and the rest, that people really do live in very separate, if you want to call them ecosystems or information systems. I also think, by the way, we could use national service as a form of training, and therefore employers or schools could give advantage to hiring or admissions for those who've gone through it. Again, I want to incentivize it. And if I had my way, we could probably introduce a degree of civics training or education to those undertaking it. There could be an element of that, assuming that it's hard to get too much of it. A lot of schools are not going to be in a position to provide a strong background. So I see national service there. And again, I wouldn't make it mandatory. I don't want to have a debate about that. That would be a distraction. Incentivize it, and you'd have a whole menu of options, from domestic issue options to overseas options. And a lot of these have already grown up. And so it's in some ways through the vibrancy of American civil society. So I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. What we probably need to do, though, is incentivize it more, both in what we pay for people doing it and then in what would happen to them afterwards.
Thank you. Ron?
I think, Richard, the case you developed for national service, I think, is very powerful. And, for me, again, it's consistent with the frame of your book, this idea that we owe something to the community of which we are a part, that taking a time out of one's life, again, at a formative period as you enter into young adulthood, and to be part of a national mission, again, giving some choice to how people interpret that, I think is really powerful. But the idea that I think is particularly important in serving as a countervail against this extreme fragmentation that you've described, and which we all are so aware of, the level of deep geographically based polarization in this country, and the fact that there may be, through national service, opportunities to play a role, social engineering, where you're bringing different sectors together and forcing people to live, work cheek by jowl with one another. So I think that's a powerful idea and powerful antidote to a lot of the pressures that are pulling us apart in America today. I just would only add to that, though, that while we're waiting for Richard's idea of national service to be picked up through courageous leadership and adopted on a mandatory basis, there's, I think, things that we can do in the context of the university with the populations that we have. And here, one of the things that I'm quite struck by is, for so many of us, we spent the last several years, if not decades, thinking about how we increase access to our institutions. We understand how important universities and colleges are to a life not just of improved material prosperity, but all the other benefits that come with higher education in terms of one's sense of happiness, longevity, risk of unemployment. There's just a plethora of goods associated with that. So we know that this is something that is powerful, and how it's allocated, the opportunities that people get to take advantage of it really matter. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about this in the context of race, in the context of ethnicity, in the context increasingly of socioeconomic status, how we bring more diversity to our campuses. What I would say, though, and it picks up on the point that Richard's making, is I think that the real opportunities for engagement, civic friendship, opportunities to really understand the divides that demarcate this country right now. I don't think we really take full advantage of the diversity of our student body in really modeling the kinds of interactions and the ways in which we could form a greater sense of community across these divides while we have students in our institutions. It's really striking. About 70% of students who graduate from American high schools will go on to some kind of post-secondary education afterwards. And when you think about, the opportunity that we have with respect to those students, obviously my remarks earlier today are focused on the civic education theme. But I think there's another component to what we can do to better prepare our students for democracy. And I think it's what takes place on our campuses, and how we try and very deliberately increase the interaction and the opportunities for difficult conversations across the divides that we know are so powerful in this country right now.
I certainly couldn't agree more. I think that this is a moment of opportunity to revolutionize and reimagine higher education in ways that meet the objectives that you and Richard have outlined, and yet we're seeing unprecedented overreach into the curriculum on the part of legislators, governors who are trying to control what can be taught, who can teach it. So how do we respond to that? It's created enormous moral distress for presidents in public institutions who have to decide when to speak out, when in favor of these democratic principles, knowing that their job is on the line.
So look, I'll start. It's this issue that I always feel, in a blue state where I'm lead a private not-for-profit institution, I'm very conscious of, the protections that I have that are, not nearly as powerful for someone who's in a different state with working in a public system, which has got political representation on boards of trustees and directors. Is just so much more fraught. And so I want to, acknowledge, the need for humility in telling anyone what they should do in this context. But having said that, I think this is something where I would hope that, quite apart from individual acts of courage that are required in this moment, to really remember what higher education is all about and the importance of being able to, develop curriculum to increase the diversity of views and so forth that we want to take place on our campus, even views that are provocative or unsettling. All those things, I think, to my mind, are a responsibility of university leadership to ensure there's an environment where those things happen. But to the extent that we see that this is an issue that that individual institutions and leaders face, that quite apart from calling upon people to act courageously in those moments, I actually think this is something that, whether at the level of this organization or the AAU or other umbrella organizations for higher education, it's really important that we're clear about the distinctive mission of our institutions and why these kinds of assaults on our autonomy are deeply not just inimical to the cause of higher education, but ultimately, I think, really destructive for the body politic. So that, again, I think we're in a role that we have to constantly be advocating for our institutions. I don't think we can take anything for granted.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to comment on those issues?
Happy to, or in some ways unhappy to. I mean, the good news is that education has moved up in the conversation nationally. The not so good news is it's getting politicized or even weaponized. And it was difficult enough for all the reasons that Ron is encountering on his campus, faculty resistance and other sort of student resistance and the rest. So it was not easy before this. The conclusion I've made is a couple of things. One is we're not going to get anything done nationally anytime soon. Too hard. A top-down approach, as desirable it is, because to take a step back, it is just this side of crazy that we're talking about civics and we can't have something that's national. The idea that people would learn different civics in this state or as opposed to another seems to me somewhat goes against the entire raison d'etre of what we're talking about. The idea is to create a national consciousness. This country was based on certain ideas, but I accept political reality. My guess is we're going to have to embrace what Justice Brandeis called the states being laboratories of democracy. And certain states might be more open to being laboratories. Higher education, private schools like Johns Hopkins in a position to innovate like Stanford, and others might be harder for some state schools. Charter schools, private schools might have certain advantages at the high school level, depending upon the geography. But I think we're just going to have to build it more from the ground up, I'd say, one. Two, what I tried to do was write a book that didn't mention policy. I'm really interested in attitudes and behaviors. And I think the extent that we talk about it in terms of attitudes and behaviors, I think we'll probably have a better chance of getting some of this adopted. I also think that, by the way, civics, to the extent it's married with information literacy, is good. So people become critical consumers. They know what a fact is and what isn't a fact, that sort of thing. And I'm beginning to see some of that gain traction. I think where it gets most loaded is obviously when it deals with either current policy debates or matters of history. And there, my sense is rather than having one quote unquote correct answer or only, there has to be a sense of bringing in different threads or streams to expose students and then give them mechanisms for discussing it, debating it, and so forth. And by the way, all of these ideas of civility and compromise, this is not just for when you leave school for the rest of your life, it's at school. And I think it's probably time to learn these things on campuses rather than see them something as training up for the rest of life. But I can imagine debates and other such things as a teaching mechanism. Again, I have no illusions. I mentioned Northern Ireland before. I tried to get support in Northern Ireland for for a museum of the history of the Troubles, where we would teach the various communities and traditions of Northern Ireland about their own history. I was worried if they didn't learn it, they'd never come to terms with it, and there was a greater chance of revisiting it, which I never wanted to see. And what I try to do is design something for them that here's the milestones, the factual things that happen, and then here's different analysis and interpretations, and expose people to that. So everyone would have in the tradition of Pat Moynihan, would have a common set of facts, and then we could argue over the analyses and the policy recommendations and the rest. And that seems to me to be the best way to go. Maybe impossible in some instances, again, where this is getting super politicized or weaponized. But I don't think this is, it's mission difficult. I don't think it's mission impossible.
Thank you. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the 2023 annual meeting.